Hi everyone, welcome back again. Today our keywords, concepts, and names include iatrogenic infection, Dr. Taliaferro-Clark, Eunice Rivers, Declaration of Helsinki, informed consent, syphilis, the Tuskegee syphilis study, venereal disease, sexually transmitted disease, and the Sleeping Beauty myth. Your next paper will be a biography of a disease. I've organized this lecture to show you how I might research a biography of syphilis to help model the process. We're also going to get help from a librarian. So you read a little bit about the Tuskegee syphilis study if you already read the Gamble essay that we're reading today, or Britt Ressert's piece. Meaningful milestones for this study, I'm just reiterating what you might have read, or introducing it for the first time if you're watching the lecture first. In 1929, the Rosenwald Fund votes to spend $50,000 on syphilis control demonstrations. In 1932, Dr. Taliaferro-Clark proposes the study of untreated syphilis. Tuskegee Institute officials and local health departments agree to help with the study. Nurse Eunice Rivers is appointed to the study. 1933, Dr. Clark retires. Dr. Raymond A. Vondelaire, I might be mispronouncing his name, takes over. Autopsy is added to the protocol. So Taliaferro-Clark was involved for 1 year. 1936, first academic article on the study is published. It's called Untreated Syphilis in the Male Negro, a comparative study of treated and untreated cases in venereal disease information, which is an academic journal. And remember from our readings that academic journals are one of the things that comes out of the shift to universalism and to a post-lab view of science, because now doctors are supposed to be creating new scientific knowledge. So medical journals like this create information, but in order to do so, they also need subjects to study. And before the era of informed consent, that meant exploiting power dynamics in a really oppressive way. And in this case, those power dynamics are racial. In 1943, the Public Health Service starts giving penicillin to people with syphilis in several treatment centers. In 1960, the Public Health Service begins paying $1 to $2 to subjects to promote cooperation. So, to be clear, the Public Health Service is giving treatment away to people with syphilis anywhere else except in the Tuskegee syphilis study. All 17 years after they start giving away penicillin, which is a pretty cheap treatment, they're still paying people who they've left untreated syphilis to come back to the office, and they're not being compensated very well, $1 or $2. 1962, the Pure Food and Drug Act amends the order doctors to inform patients when they were being given drugs experimentally. So before we have the Declaration of Helsinki, doctors already have to tell patients if they're being drugged, which the Tuskegee syphilis study was not. They were simply withholding medicine. They weren't giving them anything. In 1964, the World Health Organization issues the Declaration of Helsinki, establishing the importance of informed consent. This is from the Declaration, their definition of informed consent. In any research on human beings, each potential subject must be adequately informed of the aims, methods, sources of funding, any possible conflicts of interest, institutional affiliations of the researcher, the anticipated benefits and potential risks of the study, and the discomfort it may entail. The subject should be informed of the right to abstain from participation in the study or to withdraw consent to participate at any time without reprisal. After ensuring that the subject has understood the information, the physician should then obtain the subject's freely given informed consent, preferably in writing. If the consent cannot be obtained in writing, the non-written consent must be formally documented and witnessed. When obtaining informed consent for the research project, the physician should particularly be cautious if the subject is in a dependent relationship with the physician or may consent under duress. So the idea being, if you're having a heart attack and you're panicking because you're sick, you can't say, like, do you want to be a part of this drug trial right now, because that patient is under duress and they're in a power relationship with the doctor, hoping that the doctor will save their life. In that case, the informed consent should be obtained by a well-informed physician who is not engaged in the investigation and who is completely independent of the relationship. So this declaration of informed consent is built into any research of human subjects now. The process is called IRB for the Institutional Review Board that makes sure there's informed consent. But even after the Declaration of Informed Consent, the Declaration of Helsinki, it's not until 1965, 1 year later, that the first medical professional objects to the study. So this started in 1932, and it took over 30 years for someone to say maybe letting an easily treatable disease slowly deteriorate the bodies and brains of these patients is inhumane. In 1969, the Center for Disease Control convenes a panel of physicians and scientists to investigate the study. The panel recommends that they continue with only one panelist rejecting. So obviously this study began without any informed consent at all. They lied to the patients about what they were being seen for. They did not know that they were being studied. They thought they were being treated. It's not until a whistleblower informs the press in 1972 that the study stops. News outlets begin a moral campaign against the study. 1973, the 13th and last report is published in a medical journal. In 1973, living subjects begin to receive government-subsidized treatment for syphilis, but no other compensation. So patients had been made to live with a horrible, horrible illness for decades, and it was easily treatable with a very affordable treatment. That treatment was intentionally withheld from them. It's not until 1973, 50 years almost after the study began, that they can even get treatment. The subjects file a class action lawsuit against the government in 1973. In 1974, the government agrees to pay $37,500 to living subjects and $15,000 to heirs of the subjects. They're quantifying here what it would have been like to live for decades with a horrible illness, to not have the income of a family member who is disabled, to suffer the inner turmoil and interfamilial, intergenerational turmoil of forcing these people to live with an illness like this. In 1979, the government extends, or 75, government extends treatment to children and wives who have contracted syphilis. So that's just a little bit of the fallout of their study. By leaving it untreated, other people got sick who were not a part of the study. In 1996, the last payments were made to survivors. And in 1997, you got the first formal apology from the sitting president, who was Bill Clinton, and Vice President Al Gore. As you know, timelines are never enough. So we're looking forward now. You've submitted paper 1. We're starting to think about what it's going to be like to write paper 2. And I'm going to show you what it's like to study syphilis. You've already read some, if you haven't already read some interesting analytical takes on it already, then you'll read them after this lecture because they're due today. We'll begin by asking a few related questions like the ones you're asking about your own papers. What is syphilis? What is venereal disease? What were the cultural perceptions of syphilis at the turn of the 20th century? What were the conditions that allowed for the Tuskegee study to begin? How were they allowed to continue for so long? And what do we learn by studying this history? After asking a few questions to guide our research, we'll develop a hypothesis. So here's my hypothesis. Gamble identifies a long history of racial abuse as a crucial context for understanding the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. And I should say, we call it the Tuskegee syphilis study because the patients were studied and not necessarily experimented upon, and also because the Tuskegee experiment was the name for creating Tuskegee as a historically Black institution to begin with. Experiments here is my typo. I'll fix it in the PowerPoint before I post the PowerPoint. I hope to expand and complicate his account by arguing, I think it's a her too, by arguing that a post-lab biomedical understanding of syphilis as an entity itself, combined with the racial history Gamble discusses, were the necessary conditions that allowed this experiment to take place. So basically, I'm using terminology from our previous reading. That's something I'm going to want you to do. You need to think of syphilis as a post-lab identity in order to have this kind of study make sense. So my first step in studying the biography is going to be researching the illness itself. What is syphilis? It can be congenital, meaning you can inherit it. There are 3 stages. Primary, defined by the presence of a chancre. Um, that's an open sore, usually on a genital. Secondary, defined by the prevalence of lesions on skin and organs. Really painful open wounds can cover your whole body. I am not showing pictures of that because it's really upsetting, but if you're interested and not upset by gore, you're free to look it up. Tertiary, identified by dementia, problems in the central nervous system, and cardiovascular system. So again, doctors were studying these things happen to human beings, denying them treatment even after treatment was readily available, just to see what would happen to the germ. What was one of the most dangerous venereal diseases, syphilis was one of the most dangerous venereal diseases before the AIDS epidemic. The bacterium responsible for causing syphilis was identified in 1913 by a Japanese scientist, Hideo Noguchi. He showed that the bacterium's primary route was sexual contact. This is from the Cambridge World History of Medicine. The members of the genus Treponemae, family Treponemataceae, sorry, I'm not great at pronouncing these scientific words, and order, I'm going to skip it, which causes syphilis and non-venereal syphilis. This germ, first described in 1905, which was responsible for yaws, and a different version of it, first described in 1938, which produces pinta, or at least this is the way that most medical texts would have it. It may be, however, that the 3 pathogens in question are actually only one, for although they produce different pathological processes, the pathogens themselves are virtually indistinguishable under the microscope, and the diseases they cause respond to the same treatment. The origin of this infamous family and relationship of its members to one another have been topics of considerable and very interesting debate since the 1970s, largely because such questions bear directly on centuries-old debate of whether Americans bestowed syphilis on the rest of the world. So we talked about the idea that immigrants bring disease to America. We read about problems with that thinking. This is that thinking in reverse, how other countries thought that syphilis was born in America and spread from America outward. It's true that every illness, any novel virus or bacterium evolves somewhere and then begins to spread, but we can see that this type of thinking is multi-directional, which is interesting. We also see here a complication of nosology. So there are different repertoires of symptoms for yaws, pinta, and syphilis, and yet if you look at it just from the post-lab view, if you're just looking at the germ and the way that germ responds to treatment, it's the same. So here's a question here of if we should be treating these things as different illnesses, even though the repertoires of symptoms look so different. That's an interesting thing that if I was writing a paper, I'd talk more about. So secondary research, I noticed that not only are there different types of ways the germ manifests, but I also noticed that people talk about venereal disease, sexually transmitted disease, and sexual transmitted infection as different umbrella terms under which syphilis falls. So I also want to research why those terms changed. Given the mode of transmission of diseases like syphilis, Americans have wondered if these afflictions should be treated biomedically or as social, moral, or spiritual problems. What do you think different treatment regimens might look like depending on whether you understand this disease as biomedical or as social in origin? Why do you think we have changed the name from venereal disease in favor of sexually transmitted disease or sexually transmitted infection? So the second question here, if you look at it as a social issue, then your treatment would be sex education, making condoms freely available. If you look at it as biomedical, your treatment is going to be waiting until people get the disease and then treating them for it with penicillin. As you can guess, we probably want to do both. We want to prevent the spread of it by treating it as a social illness and talking about the spread of infection through sexual contact, but we also want to have a biomedical understanding so that we can treat it with an antibiotic when we need to. So now I'm looking at other sources that represent syphilis in order to make my argument more robust. I've looked at the history of medicine. I have some interesting questions that I could write in subsections for my paper. I think you could see different things to write about there. Now I'm looking at primary sources. I picked Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Crux, where she writes a little bit about syphilis. It's a fictional novel, but she starts off this novel with this introduction that's pretty interesting. The story is first for young women to read, second for young men to read, after that for anyone who wants to. Anyone who doubts its facts and figures is referred to Social Diseases and Marriage by Dr. Prince Morrow, or to Hygiene and Morality by Miss Lavinia Dock, a trained nurse of long experience. Some will hold painful facts disclosed are unfit for young girls to know. Young girls are precisely the ones who must know them in order that they may protect themselves and their children to come. The time to know of danger is before it is too late to avoid it. If some say innocence is the greatest charm of young girls, the answer is, what good does it do them? So this is a pretty interesting introduction for a fictional novel. It's citing sources and it's appealing to ethos. Look at a doctor's work or publication by a nurse. And it also is making a political argument that girls need to understand sex education in order to protect themselves, because if they don't understand it, they're going to be vulnerable to risk. The Crux is a novel that is about a young, innocent, true woman who is betrothed to be married to a man who moved out west. And when she comes out west to meet her husband, she notices that he looks a little bit funny, but she doesn't know that it's because he has syphilis. So the point of this novel is to have an entertaining tale that encourages young women, and maybe men if they read it too, or anyone, as she says in her first, second, and then for anyone, to make the case that, okay, maybe it's important for women to learn enough about biology that they can break off an engagement that they have if they find out that their betrothed was untrue to them and in fact is now infected with disease that they can share with them. So this is a passage from the novel. I may be wrong, the doctor said. You have not given me your confidence in this matter, but it is better, 1,000 times better, that I should make this mistake than for you to make it. You must not marry Morton Elder. Vivian did not admit or deny. She still wore that look of horror. You think he has that? I do not know whether he has gonorrhea or not. Sorry, this is a story about gonorrhea, not syphilis. I'm misremembering. It takes a long microscopic analysis to be sure. There it is. But there is every practical assurance that he's had it, and I know he's had syphilis. So multiple infections here. If Vivian could have turned paler, she would have then. I've heard of that, she said, shuddering. Notice that Vivian, the true woman character, can't even say the word. Yes, the other is newer to our knowledge, far commoner, and really more dangerous. They are two of the most terrible diseases known to us, highly contagious, and in the case of syphilis, hereditary. Nearly 3/4 of the men have one or the other or both. But Vivian was not listening. Her face was buried in her hands. She crouched low and agonized, weeping. Oh, come, come, my dear, don't take it so hard. There's no harm done, you see. It's not too late. It is too late, wailed the girl. I have promised to marry him. So you can see how Charlotte Perkins Gilman is using an emotional appeal. This innocent girl who can't even say the names of the diseases is going to be vulnerable to disease because she put herself into a marital contract with a man who is diseased. And having a female doctor tell her about those diseases, yes, she is breaching confidentiality. If Morton Elder is her patient, it's never clear how she knows that he was sick, aside from the fact that she knows how to diagnose illness and maybe she saw him present some symptoms. But she makes the case, a very Thompsonian or eclectic case, to use her own older terminology, that women need to know what they're getting into when it comes to sexually transmitted infection. So now I found a primary source that I've analyzed. I've analyzed and found a few questions that I want to ask about the illness itself and how it's categorized, and also even about venereal disease versus STI, thinking about why that name changed. Now, how am I going to turn this into a biography? As I said, Gilman makes me think of Samuel Thompson when she decries the elitism of medical knowledge. I also noticed another source point out the lack of access to information about syphilis. How did the elitism of medical knowledge about syphilis play into the Tuskegee study? Does that tie back to a larger point we've seen in class? So, um, we've seen a lot of people make the case, especially Flexner, that medicine needs to be scientific, that it needs to be involved in laboratories, and that it's not something that the common man should understand. When that becomes the case, then patients can't make informed decisions, whether they're the subjects of the study, as happened in real life in the case of the Tuskegee syphilis study, or in the case of Gilman's character and, undoubtedly the types of women that she was fictionalizing. Ah, I hate it when it does this. It's interesting to notice these parallels between texts, and I want to reference ideas from class, but Samuel Thompson was writing about 100 years before the Tuskegee syphilis study. So how can I talk about him responsibly without pretending that those 100 years didn't happen? I might say that the Thompsonian ideal of sharing medical knowledge has taken many different forms over the years between his philosophical argument and Gilman's feminist one. Again, this is paying attention to context. So I want to point out a parallel. That's one of the things that I want you to do in your papers. But I'm not just going to say Gilman is like Thompson. I want to talk about their historical context and be as specific as I can when I'm making that connection. All right. So why do we think the United States Public Health Service chose Macon County, Alabama for their study in nature? Can I come up with an answer for that that's more than just a wild guess? I'm going to look at another primary source to try to answer this question. This is a letter from to Dr. Clark. I've given considerable thought to the problem which you raise of the investigation of the course of untreated syphilitic infection in the Negroes of Macon County, Alabama. You state that there are about 8,000 Negroes in a rural area far removed from medical care, and that Wasserman surveys have shown about half of the adult population to be infected with syphilis. I visualize the selection of this material, clinical samples, somewhat as follows. It may be necessary to do a Wasserman survey on the entire population of the county. Men, women, and children, males over the age of 30, should be carefully questioned for a history of syphilitic infection. A history should be accepted as positive only if it includes a story of the lesions of secondary syphilis following at an appropriate interval after a genital sore. A mere history of penile sore would not be adequate, inasmuch as the average Negro has had as many penile sores as rabbits have offspring. I think that such a study as you have contemplated would be of immense value. It will be necessary, of course, in consideration of results, to evaluate the special factors introduced by a selection of material from Negro males. Syphilis in the Negro is, in many respects, almost as different disease from syphilis in the white. So I'm sure that you can notice a lot of really troubling things in this primary source here. We can see their assumptions about Black disease and sexuality. That should make you think about our discussions of racism and ideas about disease. And then at the very end, he says that he thinks syphilis is a completely different disease in Black patients than in white patients. So then the question is, why study it aside from the fact that you're not seeing your patients as human? You want to study the germ because you care more about the germ than the patient. That's something that can only happen in a post-lab view of science. This sounds a lot like specificity to me when he acts like it's different in a white patient versus a Black patient. That's specificity in 1931, well after the shift to universalism. So one of the, I guess I'll say, side effects of living in a culture that deals with white supremacist racism like America has is that the shift towards universalism was never able to be made in a, I guess, logically consistent fashion, because racism entails specificity in that it treats people as fundamentally different based on the color of their skin. So I've been paying attention to medical experts in the microbe itself. I need the paper to be longer and I want to include more perspectives. What about the patients? Why do you think anyone participated in this study? Um, I started doing background information, which was informational, but did not give me a great thesis to start with. I might cite this information, but it won't be central to my argument. I then noticed that the issue of medical expertise came up in a primary source. I decided to argue that the Tuskegee syphilis study suggested that Samuel Thompson's concerns about the problems of elitism lasted well into the 20th century. The rise of scientific medicine did not democratize medical knowledge, and that fact has created conditions for this study to take place. So now I have a thesis that's related to our course readings. It allows me to talk about all of my different sources, and it's an arguable, interesting thesis. After a subsection about the theme of medical expertise, I took a step back to see the terminology that medical experts of the day used to discuss the issue. They did not use the word Thomsonianism. That's an analogy that I drew. So this is my argument. It's not just coming from a secondary source. They did use other changing terms, and I want to analyze those terms and consider what assumptions they might reveal about the diagnosis and treatment of syphilis as an illness. And when I say illness here, of course, I'm referring to our readings from the first day of class. Then I consider the patient-doctor dyad. I look at primary sources for their insight about how doctors perceive their patients. I couldn't find a diary of a patient in the library, but I tried to keep patients in mind. So you might not be able to find a source that you're looking for, and then instead of just pretending that you never looked for it, you should say in your paper, the patient perspective is important to understanding illness. You could quote Kleinman if you want to, and then talk about what you did find and what you can glean about the illness from what you found. All of this made for good body paragraphs, and I know what order I want them to go in, but what about my intro and conclusion? I'm going to ask one more question to round out the paper. Who cares about syphilis today? I found a 1995 article that the incidence of syphilis went up from 410 reported cases in the US in 1986 to 4,422 cases reported in 1991. I could start and end this biography by noting that the naming and framing of syphilis remains an issue today, and that a recent spike in cases might make it more urgent to reconsider the history of researching syphilis. Instead of discussing contemporary cases, I could also start and end with broader philosophical questions. For example, who conducts experiments and why? Who gets experimented upon? What are the rationalizations for experimenting on test subjects? What have you seen in this course that might relate to this question? So you want your introduction and conclusion to have sort of a bigger question that you're going to think throughout. And these are just a few of the types of questions you might ask. You can feel free to use any of these techniques or questions in your own paper. I'm modeling them here so that you have the example. Another question you can ask is who benefits from medical research? And that's why we read about the Havu-Sapai tribe and our other readings for today. So critical thinking, how are experiments made? How are hypotheses found? I'm going to end this longer lecture with one more example that gets us thinking critically about the creation of scientific knowledge. I'm going to start with the example, appropriate since we've been talking about sex, of sperm inseminating the egg. You have probably heard or learned at some point about how sperms swim through the canal and find an egg and fertilize that egg. In this model, the idea is that the egg is just passive and the sperm is active. And this is what biologist and feminist science studies scholar Evelyn Fox Keller calls the Sleeping Beauty myth. This is a quote from something that I have written myself. This myth that the egg passively awaits insemination from the gallant sperm, Fox Keller says, was elicitable in the data. When you look through a microscope, the egg appears immobile. It's not moving around, while the sperm are clearly active. Embryologists did not just imagine what they empirically observed, but perhaps because their observations accorded with dominant biases about men and women's gender roles, they did not look beyond the myth for a more accurate understanding either. When feminist scientists interrogated this received wisdom, they learned that eggs were much more active than microscope magnification could detect. Eggs produce, quote, proteins or molecules responsible for both enabling and preventing adhesion and penetration. That's from Evelyn Fox Keller's book, end quote. To gain that knowledge, they needed to create different apparatuses that could enable them to ask and answer entirely different questions. So if you just have a microscope, if that's the only tool that you have, then the sleeping beauty myth is going to be all that you know about the sperm and the egg. If you have other chemical equipment that can look at what proteins and molecules the egg is releasing and study that egg more specifically, you can learn more about what's actually happening at the moment of fertilization. And that's especially important for treating infertility and understanding how fertilization happens. All right, so now thinking ahead to your paper, you're going to want to ask what metaphors or assumptions you notice in your sources. You're going to want to ask if your sources remind you of any class text, like the Tuskegee study reminded me of Cunningham's idea of the post-lab conception of disease. You're going to want to wonder, were there any controversies? You will likely find interesting representations of medical knowledge, your disease, and the people perceived to be most effective by your disease. So if you look for controversy, you're going to find the most fruitful things to study in all of those areas. That's all for today. I know this was a long lecture, but hopefully you feel like you're on good footing to get started for your paper. And I look forward to seeing what you all write. Have a good day. Goodbye.